Well, I think that China is fundamentally different from Western countries, and we can't actually make sense of China or what's happened in China or what will happen in the future unless we understand these differences. I mean, the big problem in the West is that it constantly wants to think of China through a Western prism, as if it is like the West. Why we're like that, I think, is because of the last, at least 200 years where we've dominated the world. And basically, we've got our way so much. And so we're very, very poor at understanding difference and respecting difference, I'm afraid. One of the things that's going to happen to the West, I think, is that it's going to have, over the next century, the very sobering experience of learning to live in a world which is increasingly less familiar to it, or to us, because it's being shaped by cultures and peoples and histories which are not our own. That's going to be a very new experience for the West. One of the characteristics of Chinese modernization is that it's taken place at this kind of breathtaking speed. So wherever you look, whether it's economic change or cultural change or social change or environmental change, it's taken place with extraordinary speed. And also, of course, the other feature of it, on an extraordinary scale. I mean, it's both speed and scale. Those are the two key notions about Chinese development. China became, this is an exaggeration, but like one huge building site, And if you go to the cities now, Beijing, Shanghai, Tianjin, Chongqing, Chengdu, and so on, there's a haze above all the cities. And the haze is the haze of very rapid economic development. It's also got a climatic component in Beijing, but basically it's the result of, very rapid economic development. Now, huge numbers of cars on the road, outstrip the American market, now the largest car market in the world, and so on. So what's happened is that, you often hear the Chinese, some experts saying, we don't know what price we'll pay for this. And I think what's going to happen is that they will be obliged to innovate in terms of urbanization. They, over the next 15 years or so, I think the figure is something like 340 million people are going to move from the countryside to the cities. That is more than the population of the United States. I mean, the Chinese are sort of the architects of urbanization, or they are, because that's what they're doing. It's going to be a very interesting model for other developing countries to see how it goes. But because the country is, because it's very, very densely populated, so they have a particular problem. They obviously can't be like American cities, because American cities are this huge sprawl which depends on the motor car, like Los Angeles or somewhere like that. They are on a totally different scale to European cities. So, to have a population of 8 million, which is London's population, is, there's lots of cities larger than that in China. So how do they move people around a city is going to be a really interesting question. So they've developed their subways, they've They've got a pretty good bus system, and then they've got this problem with the cars. But there's a proposal for this. I don't know what's happening to it, but I've seen the drawings and I've seen the mock-up models of it, which is you can call it a mega bus or a straddling bus, which actually goes over the road on rails. So it goes down one lane of one side of a road, call it like that, and holds 1,200 people, and moves at 30, 40 miles an hour or something. I can't remember. And it's powered by solar power. And I think the Chinese will actually, this will be very interesting to see what they do, but they're going to come up with innovations like this, and probably a lot of them. The Chinese government has been extraordinarily competent. I mean, if you measure a state by what it delivers and how well it delivers it, then I don't think the Chinese government has any peers in the world, actually, for this period. I mean, this extraordinary reduction in poverty, these amazing growth rates, and the extent to which the Chinese so far, I mean, who knows what the future holds, but the way in which they've managed to maintain this growth without really very, very serious recessions. I mean, if you look at American development in the second half of the 19th century, every 10 years they had a big, they had a very big an alarming recession with large-scale unemployment. So I think this has been an extraordinarily effective administration, and this is why one of the reasons why I think the Chinese government enjoys great support from the people. I mean, we cannot imagine in the West how this is the case, because our view is that there is really only one source of legitimacy for the authority of a government, and that is democracy, that is elections. Now, I accept that democracy can be a very important source of legitimacy, but it's not the exclusive source of it. We've become kind of completely singular about this. We weren't always like this. And I think that, in my view, the Chinese government enjoys more legitimacy than any Western government. And the reason is because the Chinese see the state as the embodiment of Chinese civilization. So the responsibility, role, duty of government is for the Chinese almost of spiritual significance. The Chinese are not very religious. They're very superstitious, but they're not very religious people. But that is, the state is invested in the Chinese mind with enormous importance. So the relationship between the Chinese state and society is totally different from that in the West, and it lends the state great authority. And it's not a new phenomenon. This goes back. Well, it goes back to before the victory of the Qin. I mean, it goes back in a way to Confucius and those kind of propositions 2,500 years ago. I mean, it's very, very old, and the Chinese, of course, have long had a state. I mean, the Chinese state is maybe arguably the oldest state in the world, or one of the oldest. Developed very early, and Confucius was a very advanced thinker about notions of government, more advanced than anything existed in the West at the time. So there's been this extraordinarily long tradition, and I think one thing I'd say about the Chinese state is that it is extremely competent in a way that I think most Western states against them are relatively incompetent. Statecraft is to be taken seriously. Unfortunately, in the West, what's happened in the neoliberal period is the state has become scolded and denounced and ostracized, and this is. We pay for this, and we'll pay dearly for it, because actually we're going to need the state, because you need public authority if you're going to reconstitute and re-energize your society. But the Chinese don't have essentially this problem because it's embedded in society in a totally different way. It's true that a lot of that Chinese history doesn't lend itself to democracy because it's never been democratic in the sense that we understand it. They don't have that tradition. And it's also true that in some ways Confucianism is inimical to democracy and so on. But in other senses it's not true. The Chinese, since Mencius, one of Confucius' disciples, believed in the mandate of heaven, which was that if the emperor was ruling in a bad way, in a malevolent way, the people were justified in revolting against the emperor and overthrowing him. This was much more democratic than our European philosophy of the divine right of kings. It's closer to a kind of French revolutionary notion in some senses. So it's not true that there aren't things in the tradition which lend themselves to a process of democratization. But I think in the longer run, we have this arrogant Western mentality that everyone's one way or other going to end up where we are, and including on democracy. Now, I think the Chinese will move in time over this direction, but I don't think Chinese democracy will look that much like ours, actually. I think what you'll have is there will be a growing process of democracy, but at the heart of Chinese governance, I think, will be a notion of state rather than popular sovereignty. So yeah, they'll have elections and so on, and we shouldn't be surprised by this, because we are absolutely riveted in the West by the idea of political systems. But actually, much more important, as Lucien Pai, very, very good writer, now dead, on China at Harvard, said, the key question is not political systems, but political culture. This is the heart of the matter. So if you look around the world, of course, there are many cultures, and they overlap in all sorts of ways, but they're also very distinctive. And so, of course, politics everywhere is different. But now we're on this crusading mission of mantra of democracy for everyone, like we've done. If they won't have it, we'll invade them. Iraq and all that. So, but I think that's what, roughly speaking, I think that's what will happen.
So good.
The Chinese attitude towards their rise is not like that of Japan or Germany prior to 1914, which is sometimes the way in which international relations analysts speak of the rise of China. Those were countries that felt as if they had been jilted, and they were trying to get they were new kids on the block who felt they deserved a place in the system, in the sun, as it were. The Chinese mentality isn't the same as that. The Chinese mentality is we are a great civilization. We are the greatest civilization that has ever been, I would say. That is probably the Chinese mentality. They by and large, even though they've had a terrible 200 years, they by and large still think of themselves as that they should be top of the pile. And so they regard their rise as sort of, well, of course. Why should you be surprised? I mean, it's not that is an oversimplification. But what is so striking about the Chinese is this, I think, this deep sense of inner confidence. That despite 200 years where they've not done well, and 100 years, the century of humiliation, they do enjoy this underlying confidence, which I think is makes them very distinctive in the developing world. Because I think normally countries in the developing world, former colonies, have big psychological problems about their relationship with the West. I mean, that relationship damaged them in all sorts of ways. So their sense of self, their sense of their independent identity, their sense of their own potential and worth and ability has been damaged by this experience. Whereas for the Chinese, they are able to draw on this extraordinary history, where not one time they, were efflorescent, but several periods in Chinese history. The Tang dynasty, the Song dynasty, part of the Ming dynasty, early part of the Qing dynasty, and before the Qin as well. The Chinese were a very innovative culture, which always puzzles me why people think, well, they're just copiers. And, actually, this isn't what Chinese history has been. They've not been copiers. Our own economic transformation and the Industrial Revolution drew very, very heavily from Chinese invention. What we'll see with China is, as it grows more confident and certainly more prosperous and more wealthy, then it will not just absorb from the West, but it will also become increasingly a source of new energy, of exports. Of course, we can see that now. It will change the world. Although some people argue, I don't think there's much serious chance that in the longer run, the American international system, which we have now economically with the IMF and the World Bank and all that, will survive. I think that when China, is twice the size of the American economy or whatever it is in 30, 40 years' time, we will have an international system which will be shaped largely by China, probably in conjunction with other developing countries, and we'll have something very different. So this is, it's very difficult for Westerners to imagine this because we're so used to running the world. We're so used to the dominant language being our language, the dominant culture being our culture, the dominant history everyone learns is a Western history, the dominant films are, made in Hollywood and all this kind of thing, that we can't imagine anything different. Hey ho, we're going to have to. Well, the Chinese have a very different attitude towards time, I think, than the Western tradition, especially the American tradition. Not so much Europe, but especially the United States, because essentially the United States is a very recent creation. Of course, America as a continent is very old, but the people that used to live in it are now, being marginalized and were largely exterminated in one way or another, the Amerindians. So, America dates from the arrival of the Pilgrim Fathers and so on. So it's, 400 years old, something like that, or less in some respects. So it's a very, very recent creation. So it was relatively gravity-free. Although the Europeans went there, they didn't They took their traditions, but they didn't take their feudalism with them, and they didn't take their longer history. They only took their short history with them. So America was constructed as this very dynamic society which wasn't weighed down by its past in the sense that Europe, for example, was. And so time, the Americans, a very strong sense of a sort of constant reinvention has been, in many ways, a very appealing part of the dynamic part of the American tradition. Now, the Chinese are at the opposite end of the scale. They have this extraordinary sense of history. They have this the constant. I mean, it's not just in intellectuals and politicians will constantly reference current debates in terms of something that happened in the Zhou dynasty, pre-Qin, or the Ming dynasty. They will think nothing of not just near history of the last 500 years, but far history, millennial history, as being highly relevant to the way they think about the present. This is so fundamental in the Chinese mind, so I mean, I don't know whether it's true or apocryphal story, but Zhou Enlai is the Chinese prime minister at the time of Mao during the Nixon-Mao rapprochement. Was asked by Kissinger, what do you think of the French Revolution? I can imagine Kissinger asking a question like this. And Zhou Enlai said, it's too soon to know. And I mean, I think this is a very, very interesting illustration of, the way the Chinese think, which is that they have a very, very long sense of history. So I don't think that because of that, I don't think they're going to be, I hope they're not, impatient about their rise. Because if they're impatient about their rise, the world is going to be a dangerous place. We are witnessing the rise of China and the decline of the United States. And it's not really, although in its fullness it's very new, the roots of American decline are, there's history here to acknowledge. I mean, already, I mean, it really, the process was obscured by the collapse of the Soviet Union and the victory of the United States in the Cold War and this kind of extraordinary triumphalist decade, the end of history and all this kind of nonsense, in the 1990s, culminating in Bush's election, and the belief on the part of the neoconservatives that, America stood on the eve of a new American century. I mean, this was most extraordinary. When you look at it now, what a total misreading of history this was. I remember when my book came out in 2009, people would say, well, China's going to have a crisis, these figures, projections for the future, that China's economy will be bigger than the American economy in 2025. That must be... that's so far ahead in the future. Of course, it's not going to happen. I mean, people always think in terms of the past when they're thinking of the future. And in fact, what's fascinating is that I remember no one, not even a reviewer, I think, and books been reviewed all over the world, no one said it could happen quicker. These are actually an underestimation of what's happened. And now the projected date for China overtaking the United States is something like 2018. So, not 2025. 2018 is barely the future. I mean, it's 6 years' time. So, there is this very, very rapid shift, I think, taking place, which the consequences of which are manifold. So there is a growing recognition that this might be the case. But how is America going to adapt to this? Can it adapt to it? I mean, the British example is not encouraging. The British, I think when a nation, when a great imperial nation, be it Britain or America, is in decline, it's very, very difficult for it to adapt to that. For Westerners, it's going to be, they're going to experience what's happening as a powerful sense of loss. Loss of place, loss of importance, loss of influence, and maybe that will make them more defensive. Maybe they'll make them more aggressive. I don't know. For 200 years, the world has been governed by a sliver of humanity. And that sliver of humanity were the Europeans, and those Europeans who came to occupy, go to the United States, Australia, and so on. And today they represent, I don't know what it is, about 15% of the global population. And they run the major institutions of the world, like the IMF and the World Bank and all this kind of thing. And the arrival just of China and India together, which between them represent 38% of the world's population, is, I think, the greatest single act of democratization. We always go on about democracy. The greatest single act of democratization the world has seen in the modern period. This is something to be embraced. And we are going to be enriched by it if we allow ourselves to be enriched by it, because we will find out about histories and cultures and ideas and values that we have been unfamiliar with, and we will learn from that, because wisdom does not just rest in the West.